we're going to talk about this project and kind of how we got to where we are and where we want to go from here in the coming years. But I'm going to start with just telling you a little bit about myself and my career and our life, kind of how we came to choose to create this aviation homestead on a private airstrip in this corner of the country. I'm going to lead with my favorite pilot joke, actually. How do you know when a date with a pilot is halfway over? When they say, well, that's enough about flying, let's talk about me. So I am actually a product of the Young Eagles program, as I was telling Doug. Fairly early on, it was 1994, I was 13 years old. I was already completely mad about airplanes at that time. Lived in Minnesota, grew up in Minnesota, oldest of 6 kids, big family, and we didn't have anybody in our circle of friends that was involved in aviation whatsoever. And so that's where having the Young Eagles ride, met that pilot. He put me in the left seat, turned over the controls shortly after takeoff, and I was just absolutely floored. I was like, well, I clearly have to do this, and not someday. I want to do it now. So I ended up starting the lessons when I was 13. That was pretty much my teenage years, kind of kept me out of trouble, too broke to do much of anything else. Scraped together the $58 for a hour dual in the Cessna 150 each month, and then at the end of the month, go fly. I sold it on my 16th birthday, licensed on my 17th, and at that point, I was pretty sure this is what I wanted to do for a career. So I was very blessed to have that certainty pretty early on, knowing what I wanted to do with my life. Right next door to Minnesota, there's a pretty major aviation program up at the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks, and so that's where I headed. Did all my advanced ratings and a degree up there. My sense of timing perhaps could have been better. 9/11 happened during my senior year. I was a new flight instructor at the time. And of course, in the aviation industry, long after that event, there were reverberations for a good decade, really 11, 12 years before the industry really recovered, and with it, the market for pilot jobs. So my career was very typical of the pilots that came up about the same time as me, bounced around doing a lot of different things. I flight instructed for a couple of years at a few places, did the freight dog thing, Part 135, single pilot freight. And actually had one company sink out from underneath me. Had to jump ship over to Ameriflight. Never missed a paycheck, and I've never been furloughed, which is kind of rare of the pilots of my generation. So I consider myself very lucky in that regard. After a few years of doing that, I got hired at Horizon Air out of Portland, Oregon on the Dash 8-400, the Q400. Really interesting airplane, really powerful, 10,400 shaft horsepower, big 6-blade prop, 370 knots true, pretty fast for a turboprop. And of course, Horizon at the time I think was a really well-run company. I really enjoyed the people I flew with and the places I flew, a lot of neat flying. And unfortunately, I probably would have stayed there. We were living in Portland, Oregon. That's where I was based, and we really liked the Pacific Northwest, and I think I probably happily would have stayed, but things were kind of going backwards at Horizon, and if I had stayed, I would have been in the right seat for something like 11 years. Before upgrade. So after about 3.5 years, I realized I just, for my career, just had to make a move. And so I went over to Compass Airlines when they were first starting up, based out of Minneapolis. So we did move back home at that time, back to Minneapolis. It was tough leaving Portland, but we all the time kind of thought we'd probably be back to the Pacific Northwest at some point. And I did upgrade pretty quick at Compass since I was new there, or this new airline, and spent about 6.5 years there, about 6 of that in the left seat. And by pure happenstance, I spent exactly 10 years to the day at the regional airlines. My class date at Delta was 10 years after. And if I had known that going in, I might have had second thoughts that you're going to spend a decade at the regionals. But in retrospect, I really enjoyed my time at both airlines, actually. Just a lot of great experiences, met a lot of really cool people, a lot of lifelong friends that I made. But after 10 years, I was ready to go. I got hired at Delta at in 2014, in February, the second class of what ended up being just an absolutely historic hiring wave. It's been kind of bonkers, actually. In the 9.5 years I've been there, they've hired over 10,000 pilots. And in the meantime, about 6,000 guys that were on the list that were senior to me have since retired, including Doug. 1,800 of those were early outs during COVID. Which saved us from having furloughs and saved me from having a downgrade from the left seat. So I was hired originally into the McDonnell Douglas MD-88, MD-90, very interesting jet. That's probably worthy of its own lecture. After 18 months in that, I went over to the Boeing 757 and 767. It's a common fleet at Delta. You fly both. Really enjoyed those. I think you flew those as well. Both fantastic airplanes for different reasons. And I spent about 4 years doing that on a kind of part-time schedule, which we'll get to in a second. And then in 2019, I went over the 737 left seat, and I've been there since the last 2 years here in the Seattle base.
Max.
What's that?
737.
We don't have the Max yet. Yeah, we have them on order. We're getting them starting at the end of next year. Yeah, we have the 800s and the 900s. We had 700s when I first got on the fleet, and they retired them during COVID.
What's the capacity on the largest?
The 900 ERs, we have them configured in 180 seats. We have first class, comfort plus, and then economy.
Pretty comfortable with 7.5.
Yeah, so the 7.5, it might have been around the time that you left, they expanded it. It was 180 seats. It's 199 now. They crammed some more in. But interesting thing about those two airplanes, the 7.5-200 compared to that 7.3-900, it's only 19 more seats on the 7.5. It's something like 30,000 pounds extra empty weight. So it's a much more capable airplane, the 7.5 is. It's a much better airplane, I think, than the 7.3, but you're carrying around, 35, 40,000 pounds of airplane everywhere and paying the fuel burn for that. And that's essentially why the 7.3 has been the airplane that kept getting built. So throughout my career, with a few breaks here and there, I've mostly stayed active in general aviation, which is not necessarily the norm among airline pilots. There's a few of us. In the early years, we just rent airplanes a few times a year. But then I was fortunate to get checked out, tailwheel endorsement, and then found some flying clubs back in the Minneapolis area around a Cessna 170A and then a J3 Cub. And that Cub club
That Cub wasn't in Lakeville, was it?
It was, yeah. Yeah.
I used to have a 20th of that airplane.
No kidding.
Yeah.
All right.
Ours was the 12th by the time we got here.
Yeah, well, it was a 12th, but there was only 6 of us that really ever flew the airplane, and
Only 2 of us out of the 20 that flew it.
that was, I put on about 60 or 70% of the hours every single year that I was flying that. That was the best deal going in aviation. Is $50 per tack hour wet to fly that thing.
I like it.
Yeah, I paid $600 for my share when I bought in.
Yeah, I think I was $1,500, but that was. Yeah, as a friend of mine that was moving out of state and sold me a share. He had actually checked me out. My tailwheel endorsement was in that airplane, and then he was moving away, and I was able to get in. Even after we had our own airplane, I kept my share of that because, I've often said that the J3 is probably the worst airplane in the world for every conceivable mission but one, which is, flying low and slow, 500 feet, door open on a warm summer evening, and for that, it's the best airplane in the world. So after I got hired at Delta, we did buy our own airplane as a Piper Pacer. It had started life as a tri-Pacer and been converted and back with the Univair STC sometime in the 80s. And we only owned it for a little bit over 2 years. We put about 220 hours on it and used the airplane to go a lot of places, all upper Midwest, down to the Bahamas and back. That's where this was. And then shortly before we sold the airplane, we took it on a tour around the circumference of the lower 48 and also down to Baja. We went down to Laguna San Ignacio in Southern California. I had done a dirt bike trip down there previously, and so brought Don and a friend of ours and his wife. They rented an airplane, and we did that. It was really neat. In all that time, I guess for the last 11 years, I've been writing for Flying Magazine, and that's been pretty cool in that it's writing for the magazine has opened up a lot of opportunities, do interesting things in aviation that I otherwise wouldn't have, and meeting interesting people and so on. And then that just kind of yields more to write about. So that's been pretty fun, kind of a fun aspect to my flying. So in 2015, we were living in Minnesota. I was at Delta. I was based in Minneapolis at that point, and had the house, had the airplane, and we kind of blew our life up and did something completely different. At the time, I was kind of just done with the Minnesota winters. Dawn had been teaching for about 14 years, middle school math teacher, and she was kind of ready to do something else. And along with aviation, I've had this lifelong love of sailing and had kind of a childhood goal of sailing around the world back before I knew how big the world is at 5 knots. And we had done a fair amount of chartering in the Caribbean and California, Thailand, Bahamas, and had kind of worked up to, I think we want to try giving cruising a go, kind of as a test run at retirement, to see if it's something we want to do more of later on in life. And so at this time, Don and I had just sat down to say, okay, if we're not going to be in Minneapolis, where do we want to go? At the time, Delta did have the Seattle base, but it's much smaller than it is now. And they had big plans to expand, but it wasn't really certain if that was going to happen. It was a very senior base at the time. And so we were talking about maybe moving to Seattle, and then kind of off the top of my head, I suggested, we could sell everything, buy a boat, go to the Caribbean, and while we're down there, we can figure out what we want to do when we grow up. And to my shock, Dawn, who is normally the level-headed one of us two, she said, I love that idea, let's do it. So I was kind of like the dog that finally caught the car. What do I do with it now? And so that's what we did. We sold everything, including the plane, and bought a Tiana 42 sailboat. And we ended up living aboard for almost 5 years. It was originally a 1 to 3 year plan. Lived aboard for almost 5 years, sailed her about 12,000 nautical miles, and spent 3 full cruising seasons down in the Bahamas and the Caribbean. And then when we brought her back up to the States, another 18 months up and down the East Coast seasonally, which is a phenomenal adventure. We really enjoyed our time on the boat. Lifelong memories. Now, the way I was able to get away with this, and I still kind of pinch myself that I was able to do this, the 757-767 at Delta at the time, and particularly in Atlanta, was a very seasonal fleet. They did a bunch of Europe flying in the summer that they didn't do during the winter. And because of the cost of training, they would keep the summer staffing year-round, which meant from about November to May, which just happens to be the Caribbean cruising season, they were overstaffed, and if I wanted to take myself off the schedule, drop all my trips, I was able to do that. I would keep 1 trip every 8 weeks or so, just to keep landing currency. So yeah, I'd be looking like that, have my sailor beard going, and then it's time to park the boat and go north. And so do the brutal shave and find my uniform somewhere in a hanging locker, scrub the mildew off, put it on, head up to Atlanta, and then walk into the cockpit of a 75. This looks kind of familiar. It's a very interesting dynamic. So I did that for, like say, three full cruising seasons. Now, while we were on the boat, we were considering what do we want our return to land life to look like. And there were a few things. One, we knew we wanted to come back to the Pacific Northwest. And sure enough, Delta did go through with their plans for the Seattle base. It did expand. It did get a lot more junior. So I knew that was probably going to be part of it. And then the other thing is there's really very little about land life that we missed while we were on the boat. But one of the things that we really did miss was having an airplane, being that active in general aviation. Dawn especially, she said it many times that she really missed having an airplane. So we knew get another airplane, probably another old tail dragger. My dream tail dragger is a Cessna 195, but we'll work up to that. And then the other thing was that we know that we want to live either on or very near an airport. Have a nice hangar, room for a shop, room for a potential home building or restoration project at some point. And then we want to live nearby. We know we'll use the airplane a lot more. If we do, and preferably, ideally, in an airpark type situation. So as part of that, in the summer of 2019, the boat was in Curacao at the time in the southern Caribbean near Venezuela, and we were actually planning on a 4th cruising season around the western Caribbean. But during hurricane season, we spent 5 weeks in Vancouver, Washington, down near Portland, living with friends. And as part of that, we took a road trip up to this area. I'm actually more concentrated on the West Sound. And during that road trip, we happened to cross Leisureland Airpark. 2,400-foot grass strip just kind of tucked away in the trees overlooking the Olympic Mountains across the Hood Canal. And this is the view more or less that when we first saw it, we're kind of peering over the fence from the road going, oh my God, is this like airplane heaven? So we looked on listings, and there actually was a lot that was for sale, had been for sale for about 6 months, and it was insanely overpriced for the time, well out of our price range. But we decided, okay, let's at least go take a look. 2 days later showed up, and you can see it on Dawn's face here. As soon as we walked onto the property, we're like, yep, this is absolutely everything that we've been talking about and dreaming about for the last few years on the boat. This is, I think, going to be our new home. And so 2 days, it was still overpriced. 2 days after we saw it, the owners dropped the price something like $40,000. So, okay, it's starting to get into the realm of possibility. Well, we might as well just put in an offer. And we did, and it was accepted as written. So, rather unexpectedly, when we didn't really mean to, we suddenly had a lot, 2.5-acre lot on this air park, which changed our plans a little bit. Like I said, we were planning on doing the Western Caribbean. That would have been 2019 through 2020, and we really dodged a bullet because if we had done it, we would have been probably Panama, maybe Honduras, somewhere there when COVID struck, and been stuck on our boat in place like a lot of our cruising friends were during that time. Instead, we sailed the boat up from Bonaire to Florida nonstop, about 1,300 nautical miles. In the December of 19, and then I also put in for the upgrade on the 737 in New York with the intention of going back to work full time. And then the next year and a half, we sailed up and down the East Coast easily, went up to New York during the summer, so I was able to live in base, and then commuted out of Orlando, Florida during the winters. But our first time going up to New York, this was the scene. It was absolutely, this is April. So New York, like Seattle, was hit pretty hard early on. And sailing up the East River with absolutely not a soul stirring was one of the most eerie things I've ever seen. That was a pretty bleak time at the airlines. At the time, it was felt that this was a potential another 9/11 type, extinction level event. I was flying, this is right after I was done with OE, the online training. On the 737, I was hauling planes with 8-9 people on them across the country. And I thought, well, certainly I just took for granted I was not going to hold on to the left seat. I was going to be going back to the right seat. I had a displacement at one point, which was subsequently canceled due to all those 1,800 guys that took the early retirement, saved my left seat and a lot of newer first officers' jobs because of that, for which I'm very grateful. And so the other thing that is during COVID-19, like thinking, I'm not even sure that I'm going to keep my job, much less the captain's seat. And we really kind of took our eye off the ball with the planning. We had been planning on building in 2021 a house and a hangar, more or less simultaneously or one after the other. And then, well, one thing, this area was pretty well shut down. We were kind of concentrating on, just kind of surviving as far as being on the boat and just socking money away. And so our planning kind of went by the wayside, and we really did not get too much done. And especially as the recovery from COVID happened, of course, that's when the price of building went absolutely nuts. Materials, labor, couldn't get any builders to return our calls. I was just not doing very much planning from across the country. So in May of 2021, we decided it was time to move off the boat. We sold her a few months later, and we moved in stages. We got here in August of 2021. Didn't really have a plan at the time. We were still kind of planning on building a house, maybe waiting a little bit to build the hangar. We actually commissioned an architect, local guy, Bellingham, Greg Robinson, did a really cool design that we really liked, that was based on a plan that I did when I was back in my teens, actually. He took that and kind of worked it. And so we were still pursuing that, and we were coming to find out, this is just a little 3-bedroom, cottage in the forest, basically, and it was going to cost the better part of $1 million, to build. We said, no, this is ridiculous. So we got to talk, and we said, if you have to choose between a house or a hangar, what do you choose? And both of us said we choose the hangar. We're on an airstrip.
You got a keeper there.
Yes, I'm aware. And so we sat down and had a wine-fueled brainstorming session one night and came up with a bunch of different possibilities, and this is what we ended up coming up with. Those photos on the left, that's the design that Greg Robinson came up with that we are still planning on building someday. That's maybe a 5 to 8 year plan now. But the one on the right is the design that I came up with, basically just adding on to the 50 by 60 hangar design that I already had, pole barn based, and just adding a 15 by 60 side shed, finished out kind of as a barn dominium on the inside. So 900 square feet, 2 bedrooms, which is plenty for us and the dog. We just got done living in 200 square feet for just under 5 years. So that was the plan we came up with. And so starting in the winter of 21-22, we started clearing the land, putting in the driveway. Worked with Hanson Pole Buildings out of Browns Valley, Minnesota, which actually is where, 10 minutes from where Don grew up, strangely enough. And they were able to work with us with an engineer to get my drawings, actually, to engineered drawings, plans for the pole barn, and then went through the permitting process with Kitsap County, which was that was definitely a learning process on my part. One thing that I did learn, by the way, is that you do not tell them you have a hangar. You have a residential storage building, a big garage, that's what I have. A hangar in the International Building Code is something that has jets and jet fuel and fire suppression systems, and nothing like what I have. But anyways, yeah, it was a bit of a learning process with Kitsap County, but they were overall pretty reasonable to work with, actually. And they were fairly backed up just because there was so much building happening, and they also had a few of their permit techs had quit and had not been replaced. So it was backed up by about 3 months, but we submitted our package, I think, in late April, and we had our permits in mid-July. Or the pole barn, there was a lot that we were planning on doing ourselves, and there's a lot that we did ourselves, but we had the contractor that was putting up the pole barn. Right off the bat, I knew this was going to happen. Everybody told me this was going to happen. We're delayed and then kind of rolling delays after that. It's just kind of par for the course these days. But the start of the delays was my own fault. I trenched in water and power in that bottom right. You can see we ended up a little bit close to our left rear pole of the building. And so then there was a delay in getting the trench, the power inspected, covered back up. And so it wasn't until September of last year that we finally got our poles in the ground and cemented later. It wasn't until October that we got trusses and then all of our girts and purlins put up, which fortunately, you remember last year we had a really warm, dry October, which was just an absolute lifesaver for us because this would have been a miserable project in the mud. Particularly late October when Don and I brought a bunch of fill-in. I rented a Bobcat and our contractor let me use his excavator. And so brought the fill-in, compacting, putting the foam around the perimeter, putting in the electrical conduit, the water, and then the groundwork for the plumbing. Was all in basically a week. This was all while I was working full time, by the way. So every time that I'd be able to, each month I would try to get like a week and a half section that I was able to get a lot of, really hit the projects, and fortunately the weather worked out well.
What's the square footage?
The hangar is a 50 by 60, so 3,000 square feet, and then the annex, the apartment is 900. It's 15 by 60. Yep. So finally, about the time that the rain fell, we had a roof, thank God. So then we put in vapor barrier in the foam rebar, and then we put in a bunch of PEX tubing for eventual in-floor heat. Did that, had a kit done with Radiant Tech out of Vermont, and they made up some nice manifolds, and we're basically ready to roll once we put a boiler in there. That's a project for probably next summer. And so then we had good weather, fortunately, on November 18th for the concrete contractors to come in and pour a 3,900 square foot slab. Did a really nice job. We were really happy with their work. After a few weeks of curing, my dad, who is a retired contractor, and my brother came out to help me, brought the snow with them from Minnesota. And we were able to knock out the framing of the separation wall in the apartment over a couple of days, and then get all the T111 siding up. I chose to go with wood siding for a specific reason. We are still planning on building the house at some point, and whenever I don't know yet what it's going to look like or what kind of siding we're going to use. The eventual plan is to reclad the hangar in siding to match, and then the T111 will basically just work as underlayment. In the meantime, it looks good enough. We have it stained now. It's fairly well protected. And so, yeah, the rest of the winter was kind of odds and ends. I got the plumbing roughed in, did all the electrical myself. We hired the insulation out. It turns out that it's basically the same price as if you just get the materials. The labor is essentially free. The exterior door was a hydraulic door from Higher Power Doors in Michigan. Really happy with their work. Ended up renting a telelift to put it up. It's like 5,200 pounds, pretty massive. But the nice thing about that is it is self-supporting in two posts that are on the side, so you don't need an engineered header at all for that. And then it also gives you a really large clear span. I have my rough opening of the door was 44 feet by 15 feet, and I have 14.6 clear span inside, which, as it just so happens, will accommodate a de Havilland Beaver on amphibs. That's pure coincidence. Yeah.
Anything else for Christmas?
Right.
$195
Yeah.
on floats.
Yep. So in March we finally got power in there. The airplane was a prisoner for a few weeks after it got.
Show up.
I'm actually I'm getting around to that. Yeah. My residential storage building did end up with an airplane that I had to hide during inspections. All the inspectors figured it out, and they all wanted to talk about the airplane. They're like, "Well, where's the airplane?" Like, it's around the corner, and then they just wanted to talk about it. So they were actually pretty decent about that. In April, yes, I did hire out the sheetrock, the taping, and the mudding. I did enough of that with my dad as a kid to know I wanted no part in that. And then we did get this little Kubota tractor, the first new vehicle I've ever owned, actually, just because the used ones are almost as expensive. And really handy. It's a BX23, a pretty small one, and still I was just able to do so much with it. It's pretty fantastic. It's good to have around there. Did the painting myself in May, putting in the gutter hoses to catch basins, the county mandated stormwater dispersion trenches. They were kind of big projects in themselves. And then brought all of our pads up, and the concrete contractor poured on at the end of May. I was actually gone at the end of May. I was leading a trip to Normandy with my dad and brothers and uncle, touring the D-Day beaches and battlefields. And so in the meantime, we just had contractor put in the cabinets that Don and I had ordered, and then the flooring. When I got home, I put in the appliances, did all of the bathroom stuff, and finished up the driveway, bringing the topsoil in for the yard, seeding it, covering it, watering it, which it's been a dry summer to try to establish a lawn. It's gone pretty well. Did quartz countertops, did that in June, and then in July, Dawn's parents, her dad is also a retired contractor, came out and helped us knock out all of the interior finish work, which was great. I wasn't really planning on even having trim in when we moved in, and they basically did it all. So getting the hangar organized, building workbenches, that's an ongoing project, shelving for the hangar. And last minute, the county was like, "Oh, by the way, you are going to stain that before final inspection." I'm like, Yep. So we were able to, that was a lot of standing. We were able to do that in about a day and a half, though. I just rented a lift and knocked it out with the Graco.
Brandon, is that on the upper right there?
So that was my motivation. I had a rather good bottle of scotch on the shelf, untouched, unopened for 9 months, with the intention that was my celebratory tipple. It was a good one. So yeah, we were backed up a little bit. We actually moved in on July 1st. The county inspectors didn't really care. We found out that some of our neighbors were living in their hangars for like 3 years before they had their final inspection. So anyways, we were backed up a little bit waiting on the state electrical inspectors, L&I. And once they got done with their thing, had our final inspection with the county, and it was pretty easy. So yeah, along the way I acquired an airplane when I didn't really mean to yet. I meant to have a hangar before I bought the airplane, but this was kind of fell into my lap. This airplane was restored by our next door neighbor, Kyle Williams. It's actually the second Stinson 108 that he restored. And it was a barn find. Hadn't flown since 1966. And he took it down bare frame, basically knew everything. Still has the Franklin 150 horsepower. It's a freshly overhauled one. And I knew about the airplane. I had talked to him about it. I didn't know he was intending to sell it. It was originally for his wife to get her private pilot license in, and she ended up changing her mind. They have a 185 as their daily driver. And I happened to come across this. We had just got home from Oshkosh last year, and I load barnstormers as I do 3 times a day. And it was the second ad on the sheet. I was like, I did not know Kyle was selling that, and clearly he has a typo, because Stinsons are worth a lot more than this right now, especially a newly restored one. So I called him up and I said, yeah, I'm selling. I said, well, I think you made a mistake on the price. I said, no, that's the price. I just went out of it what I put into it. Like, well, I wasn't looking for an airplane just yet, but that airplane at that price, I'm going to find room for it. Fortunately, one of our other neighbors had an empty hangar at the time and was able to house it until I at least had a slab and a roof at our place.
You'll enjoy it.
Yeah, it's a great airplane. I've put about 65 hours on it in the first year. Our usage wasn't as high as we'd like, just because we've been very busy getting in here. But it's a great little airplane. Yeah, I've had it up to the San Juan's bed, out in the Cascades, some of the state airports, out to like Capella State and stuff. And yeah, it's great for that kind of flying. Really enjoyable. So we're that's what I call phase 1 of the project. Phase 2, I guess next year, next summer, finish out the hangar, get in the boiler for the in-floor heat, probably a standby generator. We're up in the hills where we usually lose power, a couple days each winter. And we actually have a pretty good southern exposure. I am planning on putting in some solar panels and some other off-grid improvements eventually. And then for the moment, my construction itch is very well scratched. But a few years down the road, maybe 5, 6, 7 years, we'll look at then building the house on the same site. It's just a couple hundred feet up the hill, and that will have real nice views up and down the airstrip. So that's everything I have.
Wait, you got to tell us about your gig with flying.
About what?
Your gig with flying. How'd you get in the writing business?
So I had a blog. Back when I was at Horizon, I had a blog, and I've written just for enjoyment pretty much my whole life. It's always been something I've really enjoyed. And it was more or less as just a external release. That I had this blog that I just figured nobody was ever going to read. It's kind of for family back home. And it ended up being, mildly popular, but the then editor-in-chief of Flying, Robert Goyer, happened to cross the blog at some point in, I guess this would have been 2011, 2012, and emailed me and said, do you have any interest in writing something for us? I said, well, shit, I've only been subscribing since I was 12 years old. Like, yes, that's an absolute dream. And so they assigned the subject for the first one. It wasn't something I was all that enthused about. It was a day in the life of a regional pilot. But I was able to do something that kind of used that as a kind of a framework to talk about some of the challenges of the industry and why young pilots go through the things they go through as they're building their career. And that ended up having the highest readership or reader response, I guess, that they'd had in something like 10 years. And so even when I'd submit it, he said, well, if you have any other ideas for something freelance, let me know. And I did. That's the one you're talking about where I was talking about freight dogging. And that article had a really strong response. And just based on those two, they had a columnist that was retiring at the time. And so we were in, I think, Africa at the time, in Botswana, out in the bush. And I'd come into town and check the emails. And here's Robert saying, hey, we have an opening. Do you want to take over a monthly column? Shit, I don't know what I'd even write about month after month, but it was such an opportunity. I'd be an idiot not to take it up. So I did, and it's been a pretty great adventure. Like I said, it's really provided a lot of opportunities to do things I might have otherwise would have not done in general aviation, and meet people that I might have otherwise not met. So it's been cool. Yeah.
Awesome.
Does anybody have any questions or anything to throw out about that?
How much of the scotch is left?
Most of it. Yeah, that's a special occasion scotch.
The funny thing is, the neighbor gave us a bottle as well.
The exact same bottle. Yeah.
So we have quite a bit, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh?
What do you think of the 767? I don't want to talk to you for a while afterwards because that was my airplane, but what do you think of it?
I love the 7.6. Both the 7.5 and the 7.6 I like for different reasons. The 7.6 is more of a favorite. The 757, the 200 anyways, is just such a rocket ship. It's just completely overpowered, like very few airliners. And you can fill it full of people, full of cargo, full of fuel, and still go straight up to like flight level 350, 360, and fly across the country and still have good fuel left. Good fuel for an alternate. It's just a super capable airplane and just kind of a rocket ship. But the actual handling of it just flies like kind of a random. The handling is kind of like just standard airliner, I describe it. It's not that different from the 737. Whereas the 767 is a little bit more stately, but it's just an absolute fingertip airplane. You basically just think about going and you're going. It has an extra set of ailerons compared to the 75, and that's the reason for it. So it's a little bit lighter on elevator, but particularly in aileron and roll. It's just an absolute fingertip airplane, just a joy to hand fly. I think.
I'm the one that got rid of the flight engineer. That was my job.
You worked for Boeing?
I'm the one responsible for simplifying the fuel system and they get rid of the flight engineer.
No kidding. Okay. Interesting.
I got 12 years on the 6.7.
Okay.
All three models.
Yeah. Yeah, wow. Very cool. Yeah, it's
Talk to you after.
yeah, it's a fantastic airplane. Delta, both the 7.5 and the 7.6 nowadays are getting to be pretty long in the tooth. And they're both kind of niche airplanes at Delta, but it happens to be Delta's niche. And so they just haven't found anything that can replace it, really. I'll tell you a funny story. When I was hired in 2014, up until that point, new hires had never gone to the 7.5, 7.6 at Delta. And my class had the typical, bunch of Mad Dogs, a couple of Airbuses. And the class after mine was the very first class where they ever offered the 757 to new hires, which just blew a lot of guys' minds. They're like, what, you can't put a new hire in a 7.6? They're going to go across oceans. The first class that bid for it, they told them, they said, this airplane is on its way out. This is back in 2014. So if you bid to this, you're probably going to get displaced in the first year. These airplanes are all going to be beer cans 3 years from now. So you're probably going to get displaced and go through a second training event during your probationary year. So it went to like the 6 most junior guys in the class. The death of the 7.5 and 7.6 has been foretold many times at Delta, and they just can't find anything that can replace it. The 7.3 can do maybe 70, 80, 90% of the missions that the 7.5 can. Not as well, but adequately. But then there's that last 10, 15% of missions that there's just nothing else that can do it. So they just keep soldiering on.
I said I got to talk to you after the meeting.
All right. Does anybody else have
Where do you see your career going next? Are you going to stay with 7.3s or?
For the time being, I have both my career and my life has kind of tended to go in like 5-year chunks. And Don says the place that we just built, we're going to sell in 5 years because I'm going to get bored. I don't think so.
My concern was this place was supposed to be like our retirement home, like the last place that we owned. That's where we were going to live until we retired.
Yeah, plans change.
Happened. So
No.
With this place, I was like, the amount of time and effort that we're putting into it, can it please be our last home? But this guy, every 5 years gets an itch and we do something different. But the first couple of years owning it, I'm like, are you sure you're going to be happy here, that we
Yes.
can live here longer than 5 years?
They'll have to drag my corpse out of that place.
Tapers off after a while.
What's that? Yeah, yeah, I'm sure. So anyways, yeah, I've been on the 7.3 for almost 4 years now. I'm comfortable on it. I'm reasonably senior here in Seattle. I'm kind of able to hold the days off that I want, and the trips are okay. I do miss the international flying a lot, but here in Seattle, they just did away with the 7576 base. So if I stay in the left seat, the next move would be Airbus 330, and a lot of guys have to retire before that happens. The one possibility before I would go to the 330 would be to go to called the baby bus, the A320. They do have that base in Seattle, so that would be a chance to do something different, learn French, as it were, and kind of get the reps in on Airbus system before I go to a wide body where you don't get that many landings. Yeah.
What do the pilots think of the Airbus opposed to the Boeing? I know as a passenger, I don't like Airbus.
Okay. Yeah. So I've never flown Airbus, so I can't give an informed opinion. But I have a lot of friends who have flown both, and if you're comparing like for like, the 7.3 versus the A320, the 7.3 has a small, cramped, not very ergonomic flight deck it's kind of loud. We all wear, actually, like general aviation headsets.
Mooney.
Yeah, right, yeah. Compared to, GA airplanes, it's not bad. Compared to most airliners, it's relatively noisy. It's just not a very comfortable cockpit, but it is actually a pretty nice hand-flying airplane. And if you like kind of that old school philosophy, which I do, I hand-fly a ton, then 7.3 is a pretty nice airplane. The A320 has a much bigger flight deck. It's very comfortable. It's very ergonomic. It's much more modern, I guess you could say, up to date. But they say that like hand flying an Airbus is kind of like kissing your sister. It's just you're basically telling a computer what to do, and it's not quite the same kind of enjoyment, I guess, of the flying. Was that? It's fly-by-wire. Mm-hmm.
And the Boeing, is it fly-by-wire?
7.3 does have some cables that go to the back, yeah. That's the stainless steel control cables, reversionary. Yeah, the 7.3 is, it's a 1967 design that's been updated a couple times. Even the Max is, updated a little bit beyond what I fly, but not really.
Well, Rich, first of all, on landing, that French airplane calls you retard.
It does. They say
Retard.
They say the first time is a suggestion, the second time is a commandment, and the third time it's getting personal.
Yeah. Everybody's got their favorites, that's for sure.
Yeah, and the reality is most of us, we kind of care more about what the trips are, how much time you can get off, what seniority you are in a seat, more so than the actual flying of the airplane. I still like doing this stuff. I'm a simple guy.
Why do you think so many airline pilots are not into general aviation?
For some, there's kind of all over the gamut. There's, a lot of the military guys never flew GA at all, and for many, there's kind of this philosophy of I spend all my working life in airplanes. Why would I go from work and then just get another airplane? To which I say it's two completely different things, especially if you're doing something like flying an old tail dragger or flying something aerobatic, for example. Which there are there's of the airline guys that do fly GA. They tend to, the vast majority are flying old tail draggers like me, or flying something like a Pitts or an RV8 that can do some acro. So, yeah, there is that mentality. The other thing is a lot of guys feel that's really not safe. You get used to flying airliners that have a lot of capability and a lot of redundancy. The redundancy is really a big thing. And guys go, being around with a single engine, don't necessarily feel very good about that. And the reality is there is a long and pretty distinguished. What's that?
You can crash a lot slower.
That's it. I was going to say there's a long and distinguished history of airline guys coming to grief in small planes, but it tends to be when they treat them as capable as the airplanes that they're used to used to working in. Whereas if you just treat it as something completely different, and by the way, my expertise in that field has no application whatsoever to when I get in my Stinson. The reverse is not actually necessarily true. Interestingly, I've found over the years that the times I'm doing a lot of tail dragger flying, my landings actually improve a lot in the jet. I just,
You use your feet?
yeah, right. Between, yeah. Remembering to actually use your feet at times, getting the peripheral vision going. I think that's a big part of it. Kind of being able to sense drift and stuff. Yeah.
All right.
All right. Thanks, guys.